A ranger at Barrington Tops moves through the pre-dawn mist, headlamp cutting across wet eucalypt bark. She reaches into a trap, lifts a small black animal and checks the pouch. Inside, a joey. A Tasmanian Devil joey, born on the Australian mainland. However, this animal's ancestors vanished from this exact landscape 3,000 years ago, longer than the Roman Empire ever lasted, longer than the English language has existed. So why did extinction reverse itself here, on this hillside, because of just 26 carefully chosen animals? It was 2020, and the Tasmanian Devil was doing something specific in a very specific place, surviving inside a 400-hectare fenced sanctuary at Barrington Tops, New South Wales, for the first time in 3 millennia. To understand why that matters, you need to understand what a Tasmanian Devil actually is. It is the world's largest living carnivorous marsupial. Stocky, black, with a jaw that generates one of the highest bite forces relative to body size of any living mammal. It can crush bone completely. It scavenges carcasses down to nothing, and it actively hunts smaller prey, rodents, lizards, small birds. That dual role makes it something ecologists call a mesopredator suppressor. It is not the biggest predator in the system, but it keeps everything below it in check. Feral cats, foxes, rats, their populations are controlled by the devil's presence. The fossil record is unambiguous. Tasmanian devils once ranged across all of mainland Australia, every state, every major ecosystem. They were not a Tasmanian specialty, Tasmania was simply where they survived. But the Tasmanian devil wasn't done yet, not even close. Because when you remove a mesopredator suppressor from an ecosystem, the food web below it doesn't stay still. Smaller predators fill the vacuum, rodent populations spike, ground nesting birds lose protection. The entire structure shifts, and it shifts fast. In years, researchers would understand exactly what this meant for the Barrington Tops release. The stakes were never just about one species. Dry understatement. A 3,000-year absence from an entire continent is not a minor gap in the record. So yeah, not great. Up to this point, the Tasmanian devil had been surviving only in Tasmania, clinging to existence on an island. That was about to flip. Around 1000 BCE, something goes wrong on the Australian mainland. Devil bones, which appear consistently in archaeological and fossil deposits stretching back tens of thousands of years, simply stop. The record doesn't thin out gradually, it cuts. Researchers examining stratified dig sites across New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia find the same pattern repeated. Devil remains present in older layers, absent in younger ones, with the transition clustering tightly around that same period. The disappearance is not a slow fade, it is a hard stop. The primary suspect has a name, the dingo. Canis lupus dingo arrived in Australia from Southeast Asia, carried by human traders and seafarers along routes that connected the continent to island chains stretching toward the Indonesian archipelago. Genetic and archaeological dating places the dingo's arrival in Australia at roughly 3,500 years ago, give or take a few centuries. That timing overlaps almost precisely with the collapse of mainland devil populations. It is not a coincidence that researchers take lightly. The mechanism of displacement was not direct predation in any simple sense. Dingoes are coursing predators. They pursue prey over distance, in packs with coordination. Devils are ambush hunters and scavengers. In direct competition for carcasses and mid-sized prey, the dingo is faster, more socially organized, and capable of driving devils away from food sources entirely. A devil that cannot access enough food does not reproduce successfully. A population that cannot reproduce successfully does not persist. The math brutal and it moves quickly. Competitive displacement, not mass killing, is the likely mechanism, and competitive displacement can empty a landscape of a species within generations. Secondary pressure came from shifting prey availability. Aboriginal hunting practices had been reshaping Australian fauna for tens of thousands of years, but the period around 1000 BCE also sees changes in human land use and fire management that would have altered the prey base available to large carnivores. Fewer large prey animals means greater competition among carnivores for what remains. In that tightened system, the dingo held structural advantages the devil could not overcome. Tasmania changed everything because Tasmania had no dingoes. Bass Strait, the body of water separating Tasmania from the Australian mainland, is approximately 240 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Dingoes, unlike some other species, never made that crossing. The reasons are not entirely settled, whether the strait was already wide enough at the time of dingo arrival to prevent crossing, or whether dingoes simply never attempted it. The outcome is the same. Tasmania became an accidental refuge. The Devils' entire global population compressed onto one island, and there it held on for 3,000 years, completely unknown to the mainland ecosystems that had once depended on it. What makes this extinction particularly striking is the speed implied by the evidence. This was not a species in gradual decline over centuries. The fossil and archaeological records suggest the mainland collapse happened within a time frame that, in ecological terms, is essentially instantaneous. A predator that had been a functional part of Australian ecosystems for at least 50,000 years was gone from the mainland within what may have been a few hundred years at most, perhaps less. The dingo did not set out to erase the devil. Ecology does not work through intention. The arrival of one highly competitive predator, combined with shifting human land use and prey availability, was enough to tip the balance permanently. The mainland lost its largest carnivorous marsupial, and the food web below it reorganized accordingly. Feral and wild predators filled the space the devil had occupied. The system adapted to absence. And then, 3,000 years later, someone decided to put it back. In 1996, a wildlife photographer working in northeastern Tasmania noticed something wrong with the devils she was documenting. Facial tumors, large, grotesque, clustered around the jaw and muzzle. She reported what she had seen, and researchers who followed up confirmed what would become one of the most disturbing disease discoveries in modern conservation biology. Devil facial tumor disease, DFTD, is a transmissible cancer. That phrase needs a moment to land, because transmissible cancers are almost unknown in nature. In almost every animal on Earth, cancer cells die when they leave the body of the host that produced them. The immune system of any new host recognizes foreign cells and destroys them. DFTD does not work this way. The tumor cells themselves are the infectious agent. When devils bite each other, which they do frequently, during feeding and mating, living tumor cells transfer directly into the wounds of the bitten animal. Those cells are not recognized as foreign by the new host's immune system. Because devil populations have unusually low genetic diversity at the immune recognition loci that would normally flag foreign tissue. The tumor implants, it grows, it kills. And that wasn't even the part that got people angry. The part that made DFTD a conservation emergency was the speed. In zones where the disease arrived, devil populations collapsed by 80 to 90% within just a few years. Not decades, years. A population of 100 devils becomes a population of 10 to 20, and those survivors are still exposed, still biting, still transmitting. The disease does not reach a natural equilibrium at a level that allows population recovery. It drives populations toward local extinction and keeps driving. The IUCN listed the Tasmanian devil as endangered. That classification is not ceremonial. It reflects a genuine quantified risk of total species extinction within a defined time frame. By the mid-2000s, researchers were running population models that produced outcomes no one wanted to publish. The Tasmanian devil, the world's largest living carnivorous marsupial, was potentially decades away from being gone entirely. The disease spread westward across Tasmania in a pattern consistent with transmission through devil-to-devil contact along population corridors. Efforts to slow it, removing diseased animals, establishing disease-free insurance populations in captivity, bought time but did not stop the advance. A second strain of DFTD, genetically distinct from the first, was identified in 2014, confirming that the disease was not a single event but an ongoing biological pressure. What mainland Australia offered in this context was something Tasmania could not: geographic separation. Mainland Australia has no DFTD. The disease exists only in Tasmania, and the water of Bass Strait that once kept dingoes out now keeps the tumor out as well. A devil population established on the mainland, behind appropriate biosecurity protocols, would be entirely free of the disease. It would not just be a rewilding project, it would be an insurance policy written in living animals. The species needed a lifeboat, and someone was already building one. In 2009, a conservation organization called AussieARC was established at Barrington Tops in New South Wales, with a purpose that was explicit from the beginning: build a captive insurance population of Tasmanian devils on the Australian mainland, free from devil facial tumor disease, and hold it there until the conditions for wild release could be met. This was not a zoo program. The distinction matters enormously. Zoos maintain animals for display and education. Insurance populations are maintained for eventual return to the wild, which means every husbandry decision is made with wildness in mind. Animals that become too comfortable around humans, too dependent on hand feeding, too conditioned to the rhythms of captive life, make poor candidates for release. They do not know how to hunt. They do not know how to avoid threats. They do not produce offspring that know these things either. Ossiarch spent more than a decade developing protocols specifically designed to minimize human imprinting, keeping animals in large naturalistic enclosures, reducing direct human contact, allowing animals to develop the behavioral repertoire they would need in the wild. Read that again. More than a decade of preparation before a single animal was released. That is the timeline conservation actually operates on when it is done correctly. Genetic diversity was managed with equal rigor. A captive population that shrinks genetically through inbreeding, through the founder effect, through poor pairing decisions, produces animals that are less resilient, less adaptable, less capable of surviving novel pressures. Ossiarch worked with geneticists to track lineages, balance pairings, and ensure that the population being built represented the broadest possible genetic base drawn from Tasmanian source animals. Clock was already ticking. The Tasmanian devil just couldn't hear it yet. DFTD was continuing its advance across Tasmania, and every year that passed without a viable mainland population was a year the species spent closer to the edge. Partners joined the effort. WildArk, an Australian conservation nonprofit, brought resources and advocacy. Global Wildlife Conservation, now operating under the name Rewild, brought international expertise in large-scale rewilding programs, having worked on species reintroductions across multiple continents. The collaboration gave Ossiarch access to knowledge that had been hard-won in other rewilding programs around the world, and it gave the project global credibility. By 2020, the population held at Barrington Tops was genetically robust, disease-free, and behaviorally primed. The animals had never been exposed to DFTD. They had been selected and managed specifically for the qualities that wild survival demands. The infrastructure for the next phase was in place. But this wasn't just about the Tasmanian devil anymore. The wider ecosystem at Barrington Tops, the wallabies, the bandicoots, the ground-nesting birds, the entire native fauna struggling under pressure from feral cats and foxes was waiting for something it had not had in 3,000 years. Before a single devil could be released, the land itself had to be prepared. And this is the part where things stopped being funny, because engineering a predator-proof sanctuary in Australia means engineering against some of the most persistent and adaptable invasive predators on the planet. The sanctuary covers 400 hectares of Barrington Tops terrain, temperate rainforest blending into eucalypt woodland, with the elevation, moisture, and prey base that historically made this region ideal devil habitat. 400 hectares is large enough that animals released inside it do not experience it as a cage. They experience it as a landscape. They range, hunt, establish territories, and avoid each other in patterns that mirror wild behavior. The scale was a deliberate design choice. The fence is the critical engineering element. It is not a standard agricultural fence. It is a purpose-built predator exclusion barrier designed specifically to defeat the three primary invasive predators threatening native fauna in this region: feral cats, red foxes, and domestic dogs gone wild. Each of those animals has different climbing, digging, and problem-solving capabilities. The fence had to address all of them simultaneously. The design incorporates a buried apron, a section of fencing that extends horizontally underground at the base of the vertical barrier. Any animal that attempts to dig under the fence hits the buried apron and cannot get through. The top of the fence features an angled overhang, curving outward away from the interior. An animal that climbs the vertical section reaches the overhang and cannot navigate past it. The geometry defeats the climber. Combined, the buried apron and the angled overhang create a barrier that foxes, cats, and dogs have not been able to breach. What this fence does fundamentally is invert the logic of a cage. The animals inside the sanctuary are not imprisoned, they are protected. The fence is a cage for the threats, holding them out rather than holding the devils in. Inside the barrier, native fauna was already beginning to recover before the first devil arrived. Wallabies moved through the understory without the constant predation pressure of foxes. Bandicoots foraged foraged in areas that had previously been too dangerous. Ground-nesting birds began returning to sites that feral cats had made uninhabitable. The Barrington Tops ecosystem, under the protection of that fence, was already healing. It was already becoming the landscape that a Tasmanian devil would recognize. Temperate rainforest and eucalypt woodland, prey animals moving freely, no introduced predators suppressing native recovery. The habitat was not just suitable. It was, by every ecological measure, historically correct. The sanctuary was ready. The animals were ready. There was one thing left to do. On September 10th, 2020, the gates opened. 26 Tasmanian devils, selected for genetic diversity, health screened, microchipped for individual identification, were transported from Aussiark's captive facility and released into the 400-hectare sanctuary at Barrington Tops. The sex ratio had been carefully balanced. Genetic profiles for each individual had been cross-referenced to ensure the founding population carried the broadest possible representation of the species' genetic diversity. These were not randomly chosen animals. Every one of the 26 had been selected as if the species' future depended on it, because it did. The release method was a soft release, timed to dusk. Tasmanian devils are nocturnal. Releasing them at the transition between day and night meant they entered the sanctuary at the moment their biology was already primed for activity. They did not emerge into blinding daylight, disoriented and exposed. They emerged into the dark, into the cool, into the smells of a landscape full of prey, and they moved. Camera traps and monitoring equipment were already in position throughout the sanctuary. The Aussiark team and their partners watched the footage. They did not intervene. The protocol was observation, not management. The animals needed to be wild, and wild animals do not need handlers following them through the dark. What the cameras recorded in those first nights was exactly what the team had spent over a decade working toward. Animals moving purposefully, animals investigating their territory, animals behaving by every observable measure as wild Tasmanian devils behave. The moment carried a weight that is difficult to overstate. The last Tasmanian devil known to have lived on the Australian mainland died approximately 3,000 years before this night. 3,000 years of absence, ended not by accident, not by a chance dispersal event, but by the deliberate, decade-long effort of a team of conservationists who decided that extinction was not necessarily permanent. 26 animals, one fence, one night, and the mainland had its devils back. And the timing of what happened next? Almost too perfect. In May 2021, 8 months after the release, Aussiark researchers conducted the first systematic pouch checks on the female devils inside the sanctuary. Pouch checks are exactly what they sound like, a hands-on examination of each female to determine whether she is carrying joeys. It is the most direct measure of reproductive success available, and in a newly released population, it is the test that separates a managed group of animals from something genuinely wild. The result? 7 joeys confirmed across multiple females. 7 wild-born Tasmanian devils on the Australian mainland for the first time in approximately 3,000 years. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry, but in this case, it made conservation biologists cry for entirely different reasons. The significance of those 7 joeys cannot be overstated. A population that reproduces in the wild is categorically different from a population that simply exists in the wild. Self-sustaining reproduction is the threshold. It is the biological definition of the difference between a managed group and a wild population. Those joeys had never experienced captivity. They had been conceived in the wild, gestated in the wild, born in the wild. By every biological and ecological definition, they were wild Tasmanian devils, not managed animals, not zoo specimens, wild. The global conservation community responded immediately. The Barrington Tops project was cited as proof of concept for large-scale rewilding. Evidence that a species removed from an ecosystem by competitive displacement could be returned, could survive, and could reproduce without ongoing human management. Organizations working on rewilding projects across multiple continents pointed to those 7 joeys as the benchmark. If this could work for species absent for 3,000 years, the argument for rewilding as a serious conservation tool became significantly harder to dismiss. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The population was breeding, the monitoring was showing stable behavior, the fence was holding. That didn't last, because success in conservation always generates the next question. In August 2021, A second cohort of 26 devils was released into the Barrington Tops Sanctuary, bringing the total founding population to 52 animals. Genetic diversity requires a larger base. 26 was always a start, not a finish. By 2023, the population was estimated at over 100 individuals across multiple wild-born generations, tracked through camera traps, microchip readers, and periodic pouch checks. From 26 released animals to a self-sustaining multi-generational wild population in under 3 years. As of 2023, the Barrington Tops devil population is breeding, growing, and reshaping its ecosystem. This story isn't over, not even close. Inside the sanctuary, feral cat and fox activity has been suppressed. Devils outcompete them directly, and the native animals below, bandicoots, potoroos, wallabies, ground-nesting birds, are recovering in measurable numbers. This is a trophic cascade in real time, one reintroduced predator reorganizing an entire food web. The devil is not just back, it is actively rebuilding an ecosystem that collapsed in its absence 3,000 years ago. Click the video on screen now to see what happens when wolves do the same thing in Yellowstone.